The officer trainees who will soon join the Navy and Coast Guard, I know, are getting a rigorous education here, undergoing the physical, intellectual, and socio-cultural development that is so essential to creating unified, well-educated, and strong armed forces for our country. So I'm delighted to be with you all today. I'm also very pleased to have been asked to speak on the theme of the maritime history of the Indian Ocean region. I do want to say that when I was minister in the External Affairs Ministry, all too briefly, I had lamented the lack of focus at that time. This is now, I'm sorry to say, 11 years ago, on the Indian Ocean region, and conducted the first ever closed-door consultation with ministry experts, not just from the MEA, but also from the Ministry of Defense, along with people like the then head of the Maritime Foundation, Admiral Arun Prakash, whom I'm delighted is speaking today, and several others. So we had about 15 or 16 people from across disciplines, scholars, academics, experts, sitting around the table discussing what India's strategy should be in the Indian Ocean. And the result was whatever it was after I had, unfortunately, for political reasons, left the ministry. But I say this only to establish my own interest in the question of the Indian Ocean region as our natural, if somewhat watery, backyard. I think if we're going to think in any serious way about the ocean that bears our country's name, perhaps it's worth starting with a question that I have no doubt preoccupies many of the fine minds present here today. Are we still a maritime community? Plato once described the ancient Greeks scattered around the Mediterranean as frogs around the pond, referring to the diverse number of their states, which were nonetheless unified across the sea by common cultural bonds and the unity of having their shores, of course, watered by the waters of the Mediterranean. At the turn of the 20th century, a casual observer of any one of the myriad trading ports of the Western Indian Ocean could have said the same. However, with the arrival of the oil age, capitalism, and new nation-state institutions in the last century, Indian Ocean trading communities have completely transformed the ways in which they engage with each other. Their once vibrant communal interaction across the seas has been replaced by displacement and even extinction. Today, as global capitalism and reactionary nationalist impulses engage in a war to win the hearts and minds of national or nation-state consumers, what does this mean for transnational communities, especially those that predate the nation-states in which they live? Where do they fit in? Has the Western Indian Ocean ceased to qualify for Plato's term of being a pond? Now, there is, of course, a long and rich history of cultural interaction and assimilation across the entire Indian Ocean region. The two driving forces behind this phenomenon were migration and commerce, which for centuries have pushed people to look beyond the horizons of their own lands and gaze upon distant horizons, hoping to make journeys to faraway places that would bring wealth and knowledge to their own societies. The interactions that were made across hundreds of years in the IOR continue to occur today in a different iteration. We could consider these historic movements as being precursors to modern-day globalization, where the internet could be replaced by mercantile trade and commerce. And just as globalization today appears to be in a crisis driven by the increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots, within and between countries, those who profited from the benefits of globalization and those who have been left behind, historically, cultural exchanges in the Indian Ocean region also suffered when conquest and expansion of empires in an attempt to establish a hegemony over trade routes replaced the previous and largely peaceful method of commercial and cultural interactions. Today, new threats affect the Indian Ocean and communities around and within this area in two main ways. First, through geopolitical competition for sea lanes, resources, and maritime dominance in the region. And second, through the increasingly visible effects of climate change, which contribute to freak events and natural weather events, natural calamities, which frankly have increased in frequency and magnitude in the last few years. Now, to look into the dynamics at play here, let's delve a little more into the actual demographic and economic profiles of the Indian Ocean region. The ocean itself comprises 20% of the world's total ocean surface. It also accounts for 40% of the globe's coastlines, about 66,526 kilometers, connecting 36 countries and a full 2/3 of the world's population. It is absolutely key to the global energy trade, being responsible for 40% of the energy supply between the Gulf, Europe, and Asia. According to the Journal of Indian Ocean Region, more than 80% of the world's seaborne trade in oil transits through Indian Ocean choke points, with 40% passing through the Strait of Hormuz, 35% through the Strait of Malacca, and 8% through the Bab al-Mandab Strait. For India, 70% of our oil is imported through the Indian Ocean region to our various ports, and in China's case, 84% of its energy imports pass through the Indian Ocean. Over 32.2 million barrels of crude oil is transported through the ocean daily, and nearly 70% of offshore oil deposits are located in this region. Now, since we're at the Indian Naval Academy, look at things from India's perspective. The Indian Ocean accounts for over 95% of India's trade by volume and 68% of our trade by value. It's the fourth largest importer of LNG, and for that, 45% comes through the Indian Ocean. India's fisheries and aquaculture is also significantly dependent on the Indian Ocean, and its maritime exports have grown 55 times in volume. 55 times in volume, I beg your pardon, between 1962 and 2012, and fisheries exports account for $2.5 billion US. It is clearly no exaggeration to say that the Indian Ocean region is absolutely crucial for the Indian economy, and this has always been true. It's only become clearer with time. Regional integration, I would argue, has also become increasingly important. There's been steady growth in intra-Indian Ocean exports from just under 400,000 American dollars, 400,000 million, I beg your pardon, which is 400 billion in 2005. And finally, we've come up to something like 30% of the region's total exports to the world. The United Arab Emirates, which was the biggest trader in the region in 2014, directed almost 50% of its exports to other Indian Ocean countries. Similar, perhaps the percentages would be lower for Singapore, India, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia. And yet the World Bank calls the Indian Ocean region one of the world's least integrated regions. Integration is valuable because it boosts trade and the movement of people. It is important for increased Indian Ocean integration to be a focal point for Indian strategy in the years and decades to come. Now, the Indian Ocean region, as its strategic importance continues to grow, is home to a number of geopolitical groupings. I think right now we've all seen references to the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, shot to prominence as a bulwark against Chinese aggression. And it includes 4 democratic countries, India, the US, Japan, and Australia, which of course India has the largest involvement in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean does extend to Australia, and the US and Japan are both outside the Indian Ocean region. But this, you may recall, was originally formed to provide relief after the 2004 tsunami, and in fact began life as the Tsunami Core Group before becoming the Quad. After years of dormancy, this grouping has been ascendant in the last year or so, and has proved increasingly relevant as countries seek to increase influence in the region. But it's not the only example of international cooperation and alliance that involves the Indian Ocean. A number of counter-piracy operations have taken place, from the US-led Combined Maritime Forces to NATO's Operation Ocean Shield, the EU's Operation Atlanta, all being deployed in recent years. The threat of piracy, which costs industries some $5 to $6 billion annually, has also led individual countries, including India and China, to conduct their own independent naval deployments. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, or IORA, which I knew under a slightly earlier incarnation, comprises of 22 littoral states with a focus on promoting regional economic ties in the region, in the Indian Ocean region, as well as maritime security and sustainable development. What unites these countries is, of course, the fact that their shores are all washed by the waters of the Indian Ocean. And when in 2017 IORA convened a leaders' summit for the first time with presidents and prime ministers, the importance of this organization grew. It has a security equivalent as well in the 33-member Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which was launched in 2008 under the leadership of the Indian Navy, but rotates its chair every 2 years, and which conducted its first ever joint naval exercises in 2017. And connectivity has been a key focus for many Indian Ocean countries, notably in the form of China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor between India and Japan, and the Security and Growth for All Regions grouping, which we, with our talent for acronyms, have dubbed SAGA. Now, one aspect of Indian Ocean region security and stability is perhaps more critical than any other. Despite hosting 2/3 of the world's population, the Indian Ocean region is also highly susceptible to the effects of climate change and extreme weather conditions. While rising sea levels is a well-known reflection of this crisis, the Indian Ocean is also responsible for severe events in other parts of the world. For instance, recent flooding and landslides in East Africa and bushfires in Australia have been linked to higher than usual temperature differences between the two sides of the Indian Ocean in a phenomenon called the Indian Ocean Dipole. Dipoles are likely to get worse with increased greenhouse emissions. In a 2014 study published by the prestigious magazine Nature, scientists in Australia, India, China, and Japan modeled the effects of CO2 on extreme Indian Ocean dipoles, including, of course, going through history, and then 1961, 1994, 1997 in recent times, and found that if emissions were to go up further, the frequency of extreme dipole events would increase from 1 in 17.3 years to 1 in 6.3 years. But it's not only climate scientists, economists, and international relations scholars who find the Indian Ocean region a particularly interesting object of study. The region's long fascinating history has led scholars of the past to put forward their own ways of looking at the area and investigate the various dynamics and factors that made it what it is today. My friend Sanjeev Sanyal, who's not a professional historian, in fact he's an economist, but he wrote a lovely book called The Ocean of Churn, How the Indian Ocean Shaped Human History, arguing that the existing literature on the Indian Ocean broadly fits into two categories. One written from a Western perspective filled with colonial arrogance, which assumes that the history of the Indian Ocean sort of begins with the arrival of the Portuguese, and they completely are ignorant of ancient Indian mariners, Arab merchants, Indonesian empires, who created a polyglot Indian Ocean region long before the West arrived. This school, he says, sees the Indian Ocean as a conduit for spices rather than a way of life. The second group includes indigenous scholars who introduce a local and narrow perspective, focusing on a particular locality or region, which amputates the broader sense of interconnectedness. So today, it's important to understand this dichotomy that Sanjeev Sanyal criticizes, because most schools of literature do not adequately recognize the magnitude of cultural exchanges in the Indian Ocean region throughout history. In his essay, Cultural Exchanges in the Indian Ocean Region, the noted maritime historian Kenneth McPherson, who passed away in 2010, pointed out that cultural exchanges in the Indian Ocean region were driven by migration and commerce. The Indian Ocean provided the roots for the Austronesians, the Malays who settled in Madagascar, the Indo-Aryans and Dravidians who occupied Sri Lanka and the Maldives. The Aboriginals occupied the Andamans, Nicobar Islands, and Australia, and later groups such as Arabs, Indians, Africans, and Europeans. As for commerce, with the rise of empires in Egypt and Iran, there was also the parallel development of commercial activities. I may quote McPherson, who's quite a legend in the field. At its height in the 6th century BC, The Iranian Empire, which stretched from Anatolia in Turkey to the Indus Valley, linked the worlds of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. It attracted traders and goods from the Indian Ocean region, and within its boundaries, there were small but significant movements of peoples away from the Mediterranean towards the Indian Ocean littoral. Perhaps the most notable of these were the transplanted Greek communities, scattered along the overland route from central Iran through the mountains of Afghanistan to South Asia. The Iranian Empire facilitated cultural interchange, and its civilization was a blending of Eastern Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures. The resulting culture was regionally varied, but fused a host of cultural influences, many of which were dispersed eastwards and westwards with armies, traders, and migrating peoples. Clear signs of a new type of cultural interchange began to emerge. At the Mediterranean end of the empire, goods from the Indian Ocean region, silk, cotton textiles, rare timber, ivory, exotic spices, and, sorry to say, slaves, were in great demand. In the more esoteric realms, at least one major Greek school of philosophy, the skeptic school of Pyrrho, bore signs of Jain and Buddhist teachings. At the other end of Alexander's empire, on the borders of the Indian subcontinent, Greek ideas and culture merged with the pre-existing cultures of the region. A host of petty Greek states made a disproportionate contribution to the evolution of early Buddhist art, Buddhist philosophy, and Indian concepts of statecraft. The syncretism that in so many ways characterizes the richness of Indian society then is clearly visible in the development of the Indian Ocean region too. There is, for example, something that Sanjeev Sanyal observed, the presence of matrilineal societies along the Indian Ocean rim, such as the Nayars and the Bunts of Karnataka, not far from where you all are right now, in southwestern India, the Garo, Khasi, and Jaintia tribes in the northeast, the Karen in Myanmar, the Minangkabau in western Sumatra, and the Cham in Vietnam were all matrilineal. Now, it's possible that why there are so many matrilineal societies in the region could be from their common roots. And in the southwest coast could have been a product of long-distance maritime trade, which meant that the male population was always churning while the women were more rooted. This is something that Sanjeev has argued, Sanjeev Sanyal. This is why the Muslim community of Kerala is still called Mapula, which means son-in-law, in memory of Arab traders who came here from pre-Islamic times and whose sons-in-law, as it were, are the forefathers of today's Mapulas, the Kerala Muslim community, Malabar Muslim community. Now, of course, such social and cultural exchanges could not have missed out that all-important factor that so often comes along with the movement of peoples, and that's religion. Macpherson has famously highlighted that the Indian Ocean facilitated the spread of religions such as Islam, because those were diffused through mercantile communities. For instance, Arab and Iranian trading settlements in East Africa evolved through their booming commercial ventures. And what's fascinating with this is that they developed into Afro-Asian Muslim city-states. Think of Zanzibar, for example. In turn, the spread of Islam eastwards also encouraged non-Islamic mercantile groups in India and Sri Lanka to press towards Southeast Asia, which contributed to the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism and reinforced the impact of South Asian cultures upon local cultures. Buddhism was similarly diffused in the past. There was contact between India and Japan through the spread of Buddhism. And the earliest documented instance we can find goes back about to 700 AD, when the effort was made. Now, you could argue that, in fact, some water must have been crossed by the Emperor Ashoka way back in the 4th century BC to get the message of Buddhism to Sri Lanka as well. So, yes, one can certainly argue it goes back before what is documented for India and Japan. But in 750 AD, the Buddha statue at the Toraji temple in Nara was consecrated by an Indian monk from Madurai, Bodhisena, who sailed to Japan via Cambodia and Vietnam before arriving at Osaka. The story goes that Bodhisena, like many of his contemporaries, believed that Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, lived on the Chinese mountain of Wutai, and therefore traveled there to pay obeisance to her. While in China, he met the Japanese ambassador to the Tang court, who persuaded him to carry on to Japan on the invitation of the then Emperor Shomu, 701 to 756, the first half of the 8th century, a devout Buddhist. Bodhisena would then go on to play an instrumental role in developing the Kegon school of Buddhism under the patronage of the Nara dynasty, in addition to teaching Sanskrit, and experts believe that the influence of Sanskrit on the Japanese script of katakana is clearly evident. He, of course, consecrated famously a 500-ton, 15-meter-high statue of the Buddha that is today the largest bronze statue in the world. Now, this largely peaceful process of cultural interaction, I know it wasn't all peaceful because we did have some maritime battles in the waters of Indonesia. It's a different conversation, but largely peaceful, ended unfortunately with the arrival of the Europeans. When Vasco da Gama came via the Cape of Good Hope and then crossed over with the help of an experienced pilot provided by the Sultan of Malindi, who wanted to make allies with the Portuguese, to Calicut, to Koiko, they were initially met with a rather lukewarm reception by the Samudrin of Koiko, but allowed to trade, much to the dismay of the Arab traders who had a monopoly till then on international trade. Upon his return and buoyed by his success, King Manuel then sent Pedro Alvarez Cabral with an armed fleet, which proceeded to bombard Koiko when the Samudri refused to pay heed to the Portuguese ultimatum to expel all the Arabs. So this was subsequently followed by multiple armed armadas, and they had, frankly, superior technology to the Arab vessels, and the Portuguese then started establishing a network of fortifications in the Indian Ocean rim to bolster their supremacy, going back to the conquest and taking over the island of Diego Garcia, then coming across, of course, to Goa, and trying to move south along the southwestern Indian coast. And we know that the success of the Portuguese encouraged subsequent expeditions by the Dutch and the British. They also followed a similar model of trade followed by conquest, followed by expansion. That was the history of colonialism. So the Indian Ocean region then became a hotbed of multiple wars. And I think that will, of course, be of interest to many of our naval officers, with the relevance and influence that these wars have had in the evolution of culture in the region. Many of the wars were primarily fought in a bid to assume control over the trade routes which connected the resource-rich Indian subcontinent to the rest of the world. The medieval period saw the rise of the Cholas, originating from the present state of Tamil Nadu. A period of rule which lasted more than 700 years was possible due to a prominent naval presence to maintain a literal defense from foreign invading powers and the constant threat of pirates swarming the seas. The Cholas were famous in pursuing an aggressive naval policy, aiming to extend their influence to distant lands with a view to promoting their mercantile interests. Historian Nilakanta Sastry has posited that the ruler of present-day Malaysia and Indonesian islands, that is, the then ruler of today what we call Malaysia and Indonesia, this is the Sriwijaya, began hostilities with the Chola kingdom, disrupting their trade relations with the kingdoms of the East under the Chinese Song dynasty, that's the period. And there was also Rajendra Chola, who had his own ambitions to be the Digvijay. He wanted to have worldwide domination, and he mounted an invasion against Sriwijaya in 1025. And if you look at the historian Aditya Iyengar's work, he says that the Chola Armada took the Sriwijaya Empire by surprise, buoyed by the southwest monsoon winds, raided 14 cities in the Indonesian archipelago, and this is what is perhaps an Indian kingdom's first invasion and first successful invasion of overseas territory. That's why I said it wasn't entirely a peaceful history, but still we're talking 1,000 years ago. The late medieval period saw the growing influence of the European colonizers, British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, who are vying with each other for control in the Mughal-ruled Indian subcontinent. British influence under the East India Company had caused significant annoyance to Mughal commercial interests and trading practices. The British, led by Sir Josiah Child, declared war against the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1688. So in 1614, they first meet an ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, going to present his credentials to Jahangir. But by 1688, the British were at war with Aurangzeb. This war, known as Child's War, because his name was Sir Josiah Child, was intended to force the Mughals to restore the trade monopoly that the British sought in their larger pursuit of colonizing the region. But they were still a century away from establishing the total control over the Indian subcontinent that we all know, and they actually were defeated in Aurangzeb's retaliation. The British attacked over a 4-year period from both the east and the west, but the strong littoral defense of the Mughal Empire could hold off all the attacks. It led to the eventual capture of Bombay after the British surrendered to Aurangzeb in 1690. And despite its victory, and despite the capture of this important port of Bombay, the Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb allowed the British to re-establish the East India Company in that city, in that island, as it was, that became such a major city. And that played a crucial part in the revival of the British and the eventual downfall of the Mughals. Now, the British were afforded yet another pardon by Aurangzeb after they surrendered in this sort of Child's War of 1690. A former British naval officer and rogue pirate, Captain Henry Avery, set his sights on a treasure ship, the Ganji Savai, which was emboldened which was full of treasures and gems, and returning from the Mecca pilgrimage to the western port of Surat. Emboldened by the news of all of this wealth on board the ship, Avery, in August 1695, attacked and ransacked the Ganji Savai in a stealthy move in the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden off the Horn of Africa, looting the ship and torturing the pilgrims. According to a book called The Life and Adventures of Captain John Avery, Avery also took Aurangzeb's granddaughter as booty, and he later, quote-unquote, married her and settled with her in Madagascar before returning triumphantly to the Bahamas. So you can imagine that Aurangzeb wasn't exactly pleased with this. The attack jeopardized Britain's relationship with the infuriated Aurangzeb, who not only targeted East India Company officials inland, but again threatened to attack Bombay. The British, who were still at the mercy of the Mughals, promised to compensate for the loss, claimed to have initiated a manhunt against a rogue officer, Avery, and did everything they could to save face with Aurangzeb. And yet again, Aurangzeb, despite all of this, pardoned the British and allowed them to continue their fledgling operations in the subcontinent. It seems for all the stories of intolerance and brutality when associated with Aurangzeb, who indeed was both a mighty and an arrogant emperor, he seems to have pardoned the British not once, but twice for their transgressions in the Indian Ocean. And what is somewhat ironic is that our history might have been very different. That if Aurangzeb had been as intolerant towards the British as he is known to be towards some others, he might have actually expelled them from the subcontinent and spared us the subsequent 2.5 centuries of British rule. That's neither here nor there, but since we're talking history, it seemed to me an interesting story to share with you. In the south, of course, almost a century later, towards the end of the 18th century, we have Hyder Ali and eventually son Tipu Sultan, who engaged with the now formidable British troops in 4 Anglo-Mysore wars. Hyder Ali and the British were involved in numerous naval skirmishes, and Hyder Ali, the ruler of Mysore, was aided by the French, who had their own ambitions in the Indian subcontinent. He built an impressive naval arsenal and a dockyard at Bhatkal in the northern part of present Karnataka, not very far from where all of you are at Erimala. In a reported letter by a purported Portuguese spy, a man called José Pedro de la Câmara, Hyder Ali had 8 three-masted ships which carried up to 34 pieces of artillery and a similar number of smaller ships, boats, which flanked the ships. Now, despite the acts of valor and planning demonstrated by the father-son duo of both Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, we all know that not because of any naval battles, but because of defeats on land and the betrayal that led to the fall of Seringapatam, Mysore state was eventually annexed by the British. And after Tipu Sultan's death, the French and English continued to remain at war in the Indian Ocean. One of these wars was particularly pertinent, the Battle of Cuddalore in June 1783, the naval battle off the coast of Cuddalore. It's actually not pronounced Cuddalore anymore, thank God, Kudalur, but anyway, Cuddalore is what they called it, fought between a strong British fleet and a considerably smaller French fleet led by Admiral Suffren. Despite the poor shape of Suffren's ships, and though he was clearly outnumbered, he was an outstanding general, the outstanding admiral, Suffren. He cleverly maneuvered to draw the British out of Cuddalore, allowing the French to load some reinforcements from the French garrison. These reinforcements lent by the commander, Marquis de Bussy-Castelnau, enabled them to mount a belligerent attack on the British, and there was a 3-hour-long naval battle on the 20th of June, 1783, which left both the British and French somewhat lightly damaged and depleted in terms of casualties, but resulted in the British going back to the shore at Madras. Amongst other things, the Navy officers that the British had were suffering from scurvy because they didn't have enough water or enough vitamin C, all of that. I think you're familiar with the requirements. And at the end, the Treaty of Paris of November 1782 brought about the end of the American Revolution, and the news reached the shores of the Indian Ocean 7 months late. And so the result is that the British and the French had to stop, because the Battle of Cuddalore of June 1783 is actually the final battle in the American Revolution, which was fought 9,000 miles away, because it was the news of the peace in Paris of November 1782 that resulted in the end of this Battle of Cuddalore in June 1783. Now, Tamil speakers in this audience might recognize the word Emden from the Tamil lexicon. Emden is used to refer to any daring figure. And you know the reason that I'm sure the Tamils here know the story. That also comes from an Indian Ocean story, and not that far back in history. It is of course from the German light cruiser SMS Emden, which actually came to the shores of Madras on 22 September 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, eluding the British Navy and conducting a sneaky but damaging attack on the British and Indian merchant fleet in Madras Harbour, including destroying buildings of the port trust. Use of the name of the ship Emden as a synonym in Tamil for a daring, dashing figure conducting exploits like the original Emden did. Before that, of course, I should have mentioned one more historical battle, and that is the Battle of Kola. Kola actually was an extraordinary battle. It was fought in 1741, so even before the Battle of Cuddalore, between the Kingdom of Travancore and the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch were also, in fact, trying to expand through the Indian Ocean region. They'd already made considerable advances in Indonesia, conquered much of Java. They were establishing themselves very strongly there. They had a settlement in Malacca as well in Malaysia, and they thought they would come in and conquer southern India. And you know that the Dutch suffered the very first defeat of a European power by an Asian power, which some people learn in the GK quizzes at school was supposed to be the Japanese defeat of Russia in 1905. That's wrong. If your general knowledge needs to be updated, the first battle in which an Asian power defeated a European power was actually the Battle of Kola, 10th August 1741, when the Dutch tried to come in by the sea, from the sea, to southern India, and the Marthanda Varma, the ruler of Travancore, was able to not just resist him and defeat him very, very successfully, But the defeat of the Dutch East India Company's forces, led by Admiral Eustachius de Lannoy, was so comprehensive that de Lannoy, then captured by Marthandavarma, actually served the Kingdom of Travancore as a commander subsequently. And it's quite extraordinary that we have not done enough to memorialize this extraordinary victory in Kolachel. There is a rather pathetic little monument in the Tamil Nadu Kanyakumari district village of Kolachel, because that area is now part of Tamil Nadu, and Kanyakumari district merged into Tamil Nadu. It's no longer part of the rest of Travancore, which is, of course, in Kerala, and which I represent in Parliament. But I do want to say that the surrender of the Dutch is an extraordinarily important event in Indian Ocean history for us in India, and the pillar of victory in Kolachel that was built needs to be looked after better. And I would have been urging for many years, I've been writing to the government to create a much bigger, more magnificent monument to protect that extraordinary victory in our history. So let me now try and bring the story to a bit more of a conclusion. The Indian Ocean region, as I wanted to say, has over history witnessed several sub-theaters. We've had various powers playing prominent roles. Even World War II spilled over from Europe into the Indian Ocean with aircraft carriers, submarines, and so on. We've seen new technological advancements that have taken the Indian Ocean region right into play. We've seen, for example, the dominance by initially the British and then the American navies in much of the Indian Ocean waters. We've seen naval warfare becoming very significant in the Second World War. And there was a famous Indian Ocean raid, a naval sortie led by the Imperial Japanese Navy in April 1942 to attack the port facilities in present-day Sri Lanka. That was preempted, as it happens, by the British. And there's no question that Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called then, their geographical position in the Indian Ocean was already understood to be of strategic importance by the British. The proximity to the Indian subcontinent, so important to the British Raj, the Africa to Southeast Asia trade routes and so on. And the British, in retaliation for the Japanese, took over the island of Madagascar from the French. And this is the Vichy French, the French who were neutral in the big battle at that time, in an attempt to deny the Japanese the opportunity of capturing an island of strategic importance in the Indian Ocean. So that's brought the narrative up to today. If you want, we can even mention 1971, when, in an effort to intimidate the government of India, the US 7th Fleet sailed into the Bay of Bengal. But of course, we had successfully captured Bangladesh before the ships of the 7th Fleet could get close enough to constitute a serious threat or menace to Indian military interests. But what's interesting about all of this is that it sort of confirms the fact that for hundreds of years, the Indian Ocean region has been the site of battles, movements, trade, cultural exchange, occasional violence, a great deal of syncretism in the exchanges of belief and goods and cultural ideas. All of this has been part of a great narrative of the Indian Ocean. And as countries are vying for regional influence, as we hear about issues like the formation of AUKUS, or AUKUS, dominating the headlines, playing into dynamics that have been seen repeated so often, I think that we must be conscious that little has really changed in this part of the world. The Indian Ocean remains key to any serious vision of India's global strategy and India's larger role in the world. Of course, the dynamics that have shaped the region continue to change their form. The actors that determine them will change, shift, alter, and it's an everlasting challenge to understand them. But we must have a sense of the history of the Indian Ocean region, because we must always know as Indians how important it is in shaping our future, as well as limiting our options, as well as multiplying our opportunities. The vast expanse of ocean has been the subject of very much reflection, but not enough, I would argue, on our own parts. This must be safeguarded from military aggression, from environmental degradation, from the raising up of new barriers that would threaten perhaps our own interests. And I would say that great task falls to you, the cream of India's future naval commanders and thinkers, the task of learning from the past so that we may understand the present with a view to firmly grasping the future. I'm sure that the fine faculty at this remarkable institution will work with all of you in giving you the tools to take up this call, and that India undoubtedly will be all the better for your appreciation of the history of the Indian Ocean region. Thank you very much for inviting me to address you all, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your perspective on Indian Ocean strategy and history, and for your customary eloquence, and also for bringing out the criticality of the maritime domain from the turn of the 20th century to the emerging geopolitical strategy across the Indian Ocean region. Your take on the Battle of Kola was especially enlightening for all our trainees and audiences. It was one of the most decisive battles in maritime history of India. I would request the audience to kindly rise and thank Dr. Tharoor in our customary manner. We're now headed towards the second session of the Dilli series webinar. The theme for the second session is India's Maritime Journey from the 15th to the 19th century and Key Takeaways from the 21st century. A total of 4 paper presenters will be participating in this session. The chairperson of this session holds a